What if I told you that 3 children were born in 1856 with the ability to detect lies, sense death, and feel betrayal from miles away, and history has gone out of its way to erase them? This is not a ghost story. This is a buried chapter of American history so strange, so disturbing that it has been deliberately omitted from every official record. In the dead of winter, deep in the woods of southeastern Ohio, a pregnant fugitive woman arrived at a Quaker meeting house, a known stop on the Underground Railroad. That night, under candlelight and fear, she gave birth to 3 sons who would never cry, never flinch, and never forget. What happened next would haunt doctors, terrify lawmakers, and spark a government cover-up that lasted more than a century. This is the hidden history of the Cedar Mills triplets, a true unsolved mystery that challenges everything we believe about human nature, evolution, and what it really means to be watched. If you're ready to uncover a story that blends real historical events with terrifying abilities and dark secrets buried in America's past, stay with me. Because the deeper you go into this tale, the more you'll wonder, what if it's still happening? She didn't knock. She didn't speak. And yet the moment she crossed the threshold of the Quaker meeting house, everyone inside felt it, the quiet shift in the air, like a storm had entered wrapped in human skin. Her name, or at least the one she gave, was Ruth. 19 years old. Alone. Her breath came in short, ragged clouds as she stepped in from the February cold, one hand gripping her belly with the urgency of a woman far deeper into labor than she wanted to admit. But even before she said a word, Elder Samuel Whitmore had already made the decision. She's not moving another inch tonight. There are moments in history when the world tilts quietly without fanfare. No lightning, no trumpet, just a girl in rags soaked in snow, eyes full of something she hadn't told anyone. Cedar Mills was a forgotten town even back then, a scattering of 300 souls stitched together by silence and survival. But its Quaker meeting house, with its plain bricks and hidden trapdoors, was anything but ordinary. It was Station 14 of the Underground Railroad, a sanctuary wrapped in secrets, and tonight it had just become the stage for something no one would ever fully understand. Ruth refused to lie down at first. She barely spoke, only nodded when offered food or blankets. But there was something in the way she looked at people, too steady, too knowing. Like she could see through the words before they were said. Martha Whitmore, Samuel's wife, would later write, "There was no fear in her eyes, only warning." And as the fire cracked softly in the corner, and the other freedom seekers settled into the false safety of the basement, Ruth sat still, one hand on her belly, the other on the floor, as if listening for footsteps that hadn't arrived yet. She wasn't due for another week. At least that's what she said. But by the time the sun dipped below the black tree line and the Garrett brothers were rumored to be closing in with dogs and torches, the pains had started. Not the ordinary kind. They came like waves crashing from inside her chest, not her womb. And through it all, she never once screamed. Not even when the candlelight flickered low and her water broke onto the basement floor like a quiet declaration of something ancient and irreversible. Something wasn't right. Everyone felt it. And yet no one could explain why this night, this birth, felt like the beginning of something that didn't belong to the world we thought we understood. There are births that mark the beginning of life, and then there are births that signal something else entirely. By the time the second hour of darkness fell over Cedar Mills, the snow outside had hardened into a crust of silence, and the wind had begun whispering through the gaps in the old meeting house like it had secrets of its own. Beneath the floorboards in the hand-dug basement known only to a trusted few, Ruth lay on a straw mattress, still composed, her breathing disturbingly calm for someone in labor. Martha Whitmore had assisted in dozens of births, but none like this. Ruth wasn't crying. She wasn't writhing or begging for relief. She stared at the ceiling with half-lidded eyes, as though her body were merely a vessel, and something else, something older, was doing the work. Her hands stayed folded across her chest. When the contractions came, her face didn't flinch. She just waited. Quiet. Listening. "What do you feel, child?" Martha had whispered, pressing her ear gently against Ruth's belly. Ruth opened her eyes, bright, unblinking, full of eerie clarity. "3, she said softly. 3 boys. They've been waiting for tonight." Outside, the distant howl of dogs pierced the stillness. Above them, Elder Samuel whispered that the Garrett brothers were closer than anyone had feared, The tunnel was ready, but Ruth could no longer be moved. Her labor had begun in full. But if the atmosphere was tense above ground, what unfolded below was unlike anything ever recorded in any medical journal. The first child came without sound. No scream. No cry. Only breath. Calm. Focused. Eyes open. Alert. Martha caught him stunned to find him not only breathing, but watching. Before she could cut the cord, the second emerged. The same. Breathing. Awake. Silent. Then the third sliding into the flickering candlelight like he had always known this moment would come. 3 infants, all born in utter silence, all staring, all listening, as if they knew the men above them were hunting, sniffing, pacing mere feet away. But the children didn't make a sound. It wasn't just unnatural, it was impossible. And yet it happened. In the dark belly of a church not meant for miracles, something beyond science, beyond history had entered the world without fanfare, but not without purpose. And the silence was just beginning. The candle burned low. The floorboards above had gone still. And in that breathless silence after the impossible birth of 3 silent sons, Martha finally looked at Ruth and knew. The girl's breathing had changed. Slower. Shallow. Her skin pale before now shimmered with the gray tone of something slipping away. The birth had taken something from her, something final. Martha tried everything she knew, compresses, stitching, whispered prayers, but it was as if Ruth had accepted this ending long before the night began. Her eyes, once bright with uncanny clarity, were now glassy but calm. There was no panic, no pain. Just the steady unraveling of someone who had seen the future and chosen to let it come. "I'm losing her," Martha whispered, her hands stained with blood. Her daughter Rebecca wept quietly in the corner, clutching one of the infants. But Ruth raised her hand just once and motioned for Martha to lean in closer. And then, barely more than a breath, Ruth spoke her final words. Words that would echo not only through the walls of that hidden basement, but through the lives of everyone who would ever encounter the 3 boys now resting in her arms. "They'll know things," she whispered. "They'll always know. Take care of them. But remember, they're not like other children." Martha stared at her, frozen. Not by the words, but by the way Ruth said them, not with fear, but with absolute conviction. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. A prophecy. Moments later, Ruth exhaled for the last time. Outside, the wind screamed through the frozen trees. Dogs barked in the distance. But below the floor of that meeting house, a mother died, holding the future of something the world wasn't ready to understand. And that left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills with an impossible dilemma. 3 newborns. No father. No papers. No status. No explanation. They were born free, but belonged nowhere. The silence of their birth would not last, and the consequences of Ruth's final breath would ripple forward like a crack beneath the ice, silence spreading, waiting to break through. The triplets had entered the world in silence, but the world very soon would be forced to listen. Most children cry when they're hungry, laugh when tickled, wail when frightened. These 3 boys, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, did none of those things. They were fed, bathed, held like any other newborns. But their reactions were dissonant, misaligned, as if something in them was wired not for comfort, but for observation. They stared too long, moved too little, and always in eerie synchrony. In the quiet months after Ruth's death, the Quaker community of Cedar Mills came together, as they always had, to care, to shelter, to do what was right. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. These children didn't belong to one family. They belonged to all of them, and to none of them. Rotating among households, they were cared for like sons, yet never quite treated like children. Martha Whitmore was the first to write it down. In her second journal, kept hidden in a drawer beneath her bed, she noted something unsettling. The boys turn their heads in unison, always toward places no one stands. But when someone eventually does appear, it is often someone with trouble in their heart. That alone could have been dismissed as coincidence. But it didn't stop. At 6 months, the triplets began reacting before events happened. Before a visitor arrived at the door, they would go still. Before a thunderstorm, they would curl together without prompting. And when someone lied, even something harmless, They would each simultaneously look away. It wasn't misbehavior. It was judgment. Quiet, piercing, and unignorable. The townsfolk tried to rationalize it. Some children are just sensitive, they whispered. But the feeling was growing. The boys weren't responding to the world, they were reading it. Not just facial expressions or tone. Something deeper. Something most adults weren't ready to name. Even the most well-intentioned caregivers felt it creeping, in a sense that their thoughts weren't entirely private anymore. As if merely entering the same room as the boys revealed something hidden within themselves. It wasn't that the boys were strange. It was that they made you feel like you were. And the question started spreading softly like a chill under the skin. What if they weren't learning how to be human? Because they already knew something more. It started with small things. A neighbor offering bread to Martha while muttering something about not having seen the boys in days. They looked at her, all three, and turned their heads slowly to the side as if detecting something rotten in her voice, not her basket. When she left, Martha opened the loaf. Molded through. Green in the center. Uneaten. Another time, Ezra, barely able to walk, was seen gripping the sleeve of a man from out of town, eyes locked onto his face. He said nothing. Just stared. The man, uncomfortable, left that evening. 2 days later, news came back. The man had been arrested in Circleville for fraud and battery. No one told the children. But they had already known. These weren't hunches. These weren't accidents. By their first birthday, the triplets had developed something uncanny. A sensitivity not just to lies, but to the intention behind them. As if they could taste dishonesty the moment it touched the air. "They look straight through you," one elder whispered. "As if they already know what you're about to do, and they've already judged it. Even the gentlest deceptions. We'll go outside soon. There's candy if you sit still," were met with synchronized glances turning away like they'd heard something indecent. And when someone entered a room with heavy emotion, rage hidden under smiles, guilt masked in laughter, the boys would freeze. All three. Still as statues. As if hearing something the rest of the room couldn't. It wasn't just unsettling. It was inconvenient to adults who relied on their words being trusted. The town had grown used to politeness, small lies, civil deception. But the triplets didn't tolerate falsehoods, not in action, not in tone, not in thought. They didn't speak often. But when they did, it landed like a bell in fog. "She's lying. He's not safe. Don't open that door." And they were never wrong. By their second year, Cedar Mills was no longer whispering behind closed doors. It was watching, wondering, and in some cases, avoiding. Because when a child sees what you've buried inside yourself, what does that make them? And what does that make you? It was a cold morning in early spring when the stranger arrived in Cedar Mills. He came with mud on his boots and a Bible under his arm, claiming to be a distant cousin of the Hodges family. Said he had Quaker blood and hands that knew honest work. His voice was warm, practiced. His smile quick, too easy. The town was cautious but welcoming. Cedar Mills had seen drifters before, fugitives, freedmen, men with war behind their eyes. But this one was different. Not in how he looked, but in how the triplets reacted. They were 3 years old, playing quietly beneath the eaves of the meeting house. As the man approached, all three stopped what they were doing simultaneously without word or gesture. They stood up, turned to him, and stared. Not with curiosity. With rejection. Ezra stepped forward first. Pointed. "He's not who he says he is." The man chuckled nervously. "Is that so?" he said, glancing at the others. But Caleb followed, tugged at Martha's skirt, and whispered, "He wants something that doesn't belong to him." Isaac didn't speak. He simply stared at the man's hands, trembling. Then slowly shook his head. It was the kind of moment adults try to laugh off. Children say strange things. They're impressionable. But there was something in their voices, measured, calm, final, that stuck like a splinter in the air. 2 days later, the man was gone. Slipped away in the night before sunrise. He left behind an empty satchel, stolen silverware from the Miller family, and most disturbingly, a crude hand-drawn map of the town's underground railroad tunnels. He hadn't come for rest. He'd come for betrayal. Had the boys not spoken, no one would have known. Not until it was too late. From that day forward, even the doubters in Cedar Mills began to hesitate. Because it wasn't just that the triplets saw through him. It was that they saw him before he revealed himself. And that begged a deeper question no one dared ask aloud. How many more have they seen and simply chosen not to say? At first, the townspeople tried to ignore it. Strange children were still children. And Cedar Mills, built on silent faith and hard soil, had endured worse than odd behavior. But as the triplets grew, so did the town's unease. And avoidance slowly replaced affection. No one said it aloud, but it was there in the glances, the excuses, the widening space between the boys and everyone else. Birthday invitations were lost in the snow. Neighbors forgot to stop by. The Smiths stopped sitting near them during Sunday prayer. Even the most devout among them began whispering words like unnatural, watchful, and most damning dangerous. It wasn't what the boys did. It was what they didn't. They didn't laugh when others did. They didn't flinch when the church bell rang. They didn't cry, not even when hurt. And worst of all, they never asked questions. It was as if they already knew the answers and simply chose not to speak them. They don't feel like children, someone finally confessed. They feel like mirrors. But only the kind that shows what you don't want to see. Shopkeepers noticed that thefts always dropped when the boys passed by. But they also noticed customers leaving faster. A young woman reportedly left her groceries behind entirely after Ezra stared at her for just 3 seconds. When asked why, she replied, "I remembered something I hadn't thought of in 10 years. Something I lied about." And that was the problem. The boys didn't accuse. They revealed. They never shouted, never tattled. But their silence had weight. Their presence disrupted the fragile peace people held within themselves. What if your regret wasn't as hidden as you thought? What if your bitterness had a shape? And worse, what if 3 children could see it without blinking? By the time they turned 5, the triplets still rotated between households, but fewer families volunteered. People whispered that their home wasn't suitable, or that their youngest was too impressionable. But everyone knew what it meant. The town still fed them, still clothed them. But they had stopped loving them. And somewhere deep down, they all began to fear the same thing. What happens when the boys stop watching and start judging out loud? It didn't start with screams. It started with stillness. One morning in autumn, the triplets, now 6, stood silently at the edge of the orchard behind the Whitmore farm. Faces pale, hands clasped, eyes fixed on something far beyond the hills. 10 minutes later, the news came. A boy from the next county had fallen from a hayloft. Broken neck, dead on impact. The town called it coincidence, but it wasn't the last. The boys began reacting to things before they happened. Tragedies, losses, ruptures in human intention. They'd go silent just before someone received bad news. Wake in the night minutes before a barn caught fire 3 miles away. And worst of all, they would grow cold, distant just before someone died. Martha tried to track it in her journal. She stopped after 3 weeks. "It's not their fault," she wrote, "but it feels like they're carrying news from places they've never seen." Their gift, if that's what it was, had outgrown the borders of Cedar Mills. It reached into towns they'd never visited, toward people they'd never met. The boys no longer had to see danger to sense it. They could feel it humming through the air. But instead of marveling, the town grew fearful. What do you do with children who feel death before it arrives but can't stop it? What do you do when a child looks at you and quietly says, "You should go say goodbye before anything has gone wrong"? You stop asking them to speak. You start hoping they'll stay silent. They were no longer just different. They were dangerous. Not because of what they did, but because of what they knew and how powerless everyone else felt in comparison. The boys stopped being invited anywhere. They stopped being touched. Even the most faithful began crossing themselves quietly after passing them. They weren't children anymore. Not in the eyes of Cedar Mills. They were something else. Something that made people feel exposed, powerless, and watched. And from that point on, the town didn't fear what the boys could do. They feared what the boys might already know. His name was James Morrison, 32, clean-shaven, soft-spoken. A former carpenter turned volunteer for the Underground Railroad. He arrived in Cedar Mills with stories of loss and faith, and he was welcomed with open arms. He prayed louder than most, worked harder than most, and when he asked to stay in the meeting house basement just for a few nights, no one objected. Not at first. But the triplets did. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They simply stared at him with such intense silence that even James seemed unnerved. Ezra whispered to Martha. "He's not here to help," Caleb added. "He talks too loud to hide what he's thinking." Martha, torn between instinct and charity, watched quietly. And that night she caught all 3 boys awake, standing at the cellar door, listening. "He's going to betray someone," Isaac said. "Soon," Martha told the town elders. They smiled, nodded politely, and dismissed her entirely. "They're just children, imaginative, sensitive. This man is doing the Lord's work." The next week, a freedom seeker named Eliza was captured just hours after leaving Cedar Mills, beaten, interrogated. Somehow her route had been exposed. The week after that, a map of Station 14's tunnel system went missing. Still no one wanted to accuse James Morrison. He was kind, helpful, white, and adult. But the boys watched him like a ticking clock. They avoided rooms he entered, refused to eat if he served the food. Until one day Ezra stood in front of the entire congregation and said, "You are pretending to be something good, but your hands are soaked in betrayal." James laughed, called it blasphemy. Everyone else called it inappropriate. 3 days later, James disappeared. So did a hidden chest containing the names of 14 fugitives in hiding. And that's when Cedar Mills realized the boys hadn't been wrong. They'd been ignored. But by then it was too late. Too many people had decided it was easier to doubt children than to face an uncomfortable truth. And from that moment forward, the triplets stopped warning anyone. Because if no one listened, what was the point of speaking at all? Something broke in Cedar Mills after James Morrison vanished. It wasn't just trust, it was the illusion that everyone had been holding together for too long. That faith could cover fear. That silence could protect them. That the triplets were just children. But now they were something else. A presence. A division. A mirror none of them wanted to face. At the heart of the town, a quiet war began. Not of weapons, but of words, glances, and closed doors. Some believed the boys were blessed, sent to warn to protect. Others believed they were marked, born of unnatural origin, pulling danger toward the town like a storm no one could outrun. Families argued behind locked windows. Elders began to meet in private without inviting Martha. Even sermons shifted subtle references to humility, obedience, and the dangers of pride cloaked in prophecy. They never named the boys directly. They didn't have to. The triplets became ghosts in their own town, seen but unwelcome, cared for but unloved, and those who still defended them began to suffer the same fate. Rebecca Whitmore lost her job teaching scripture. Too attached, they whispered. The Miller family, who once housed the boys weekly, found their barn mysteriously burned in the night. No one investigated. Even Martha, once a cornerstone of the community, found her door unknocked, her presence quietly avoided. Fear spreads fast when the enemy has no face. And for Cedar Mills, the true terror wasn't what the triplets had done. It was what they might do next, and what they might already know. They were children without anger, without tantrums, without revenge. And somehow that terrified people more than anything else. One Sunday, all 3 boys entered the meeting house and sat silently in the back. No one greeted them. No one met their eyes. By the end of the sermon, half the congregation had left, without a word. That night, Martha wrote only one line in her journal. "It is not what they are that frightens people. It is what we have become in their presence." It began with the letters. Faint handwriting. No return addresses. Postmarked from counties that barely showed up on maps. But what they described was impossible to ignore. A fire in New Liberty, children saved from a collapsing schoolhouse after one boy screamed minutes before the floor gave out. A preacher in Belmont struck mute mid-sermon moments after a silent child in the front pew stared at him with unblinking eyes. A fugitive in Athens, Georgia, caught because some small voice just knew where he was hiding. Each letter mentioned different places, different names, but they all included one terrifying pattern: 3 boys. Always silent. Always watching. Always ahead. Martha read them late into the night, her hands trembling. Some had been written by teachers. Others by town doctors. A few came from grieving mothers who didn't understand what had spared their children, or what had taken their voices away. But one letter shattered everything. "I don't know who they are," it read. "But they appear before disaster. They don't prevent it, they witness it. And they're always the same age, the same faces, from 300 miles apart. No one else notices it. But I've seen them. I know them." Attached was a crude sketch. It was them. Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. A drawing made by a woman who had never stepped foot in Cedar Mills. That's when Martha realized this wasn't local. It wasn't random. It wasn't even new. The boys were moving in ways no one could see. Or perhaps they weren't moving at all and the world was folding toward them. She tried to show the elders. She begged them to listen. They called her tired, overwrought, possibly touched in the mind. So she turned to her journal and wrote one line across 3 pages: "They are not ours. They never were." From that moment, the question was no longer whether the boys were different. The question became how many others had seen them before and simply refused to remember. It didn't happen all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easy to name. Instead, it came like a slow tide, quiet, deliberate, and merciless. First was the Miller patriarch, a healthy man just past 60 who had once taken the boys in when no one else would. He died in his sleep with no warning. His wife said he'd complained of strange dreams the week before, dreams of being watched from inside his own walls. Then it was Rebecca Whitmore. She slipped on a dry stair, fell backward, and never woke up. The coroner couldn't explain the angle of the fall. The stairs weren't wet. Her shoes were flat. The lamp had blown out moments before she stepped down. Next came Mrs. Langley, a midwife who once cradled the triplets as infants and swore they were marked by a greater design. Her farmhouse caught fire in the middle of the night. She got out. Her husband didn't. The fire marshal found no origin point. No fuel. Just ash. By summer's end, 7 people who had once sheltered the boys, fed them, defended them, loved them, had suffered uncanny accidents, mysterious illness, or quiet, inexplicable misfortune. At first, people said nothing. But fear has a way of spreading even in silence. "They're not hurting anyone," one elder whispered. "But they don't stop it either." Another said, "Maybe they're not doing this. Maybe it just happens around them." Martha refused to believe it. But then she saw Isaac staring out the window one evening, expression, blank fingers tapping a slow rhythm, and 10 minutes later, a thunderstorm shattered the west fence, killing 2 calves and destroying half the winter stock. The boys said nothing, but they didn't look surprised. And that's what truly terrified the town. Not that the boys caused the tragedies, but that they saw them coming and let them unfold. Because maybe they weren't guardians. Maybe they weren't prophets. Maybe they were just witnesses. And wherever they stayed too long, something followed. Something old. Something patient. Something that didn't care what people believed. And once that seed took root in the town's mind, no one looked at the boys with pity anymore. Only with distance and dread. Her name was Agatha Cleary. A widow, sharp-minded and unafraid of whispers. She had no children of her own, but she'd watched the triplets grow since infancy. And when the town began to shrink away from them like a wound turning inward, she did what no one else dared. She made a decision. "I'll take them," she said. "Somewhere far. Where no one knows. Where they can start again." The town said nothing. Not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. Afraid the boys might stay. Afraid they might go. And afraid of what either choice might mean. Agatha packed a wagon under cover of dawn. Blankets. Bread. A few letters from Martha wrapped in oilskin. She loaded the boys, now 8, without question. They didn't cry. They didn't smile. They simply climbed in as if they'd known this moment would come. The first hour passed in silence. The second in strange discomfort. Agatha noticed the air growing heavier. The birds quiet. The road longer than it should have been. By noon, she realized they were still within town limits, though they had been traveling east for 4 hours. She turned the horse, went north, then west. Every path curved back on itself. Every trail returned to Cedar Mills. The sky stayed gray. The sun never moved. "It's not working," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, eyes calm. "We know," he said. Ezra added, "We can't leave until it's finished." "Finished?" Agatha asked. But they said nothing more. That night she stayed in the barn behind Martha's house. At dawn the wagon was gone, the horse dead. The wheels cracked in a perfect circle. The boys were asleep on the floor, hands folded neatly. Agatha never spoke of it again. But she never tried to leave either. And in her silence the town understood something too big to say aloud. Cedar Mills wasn't just where the boys had been born. It was where whatever they were had rooted. And it would not let them go. Not yet. Cedar Mills is no longer on any map. Not even as a ruin, a ghost town, or a historical footnote. It's as if it never existed, erased not by time, but by deliberate forgetting. Old atlases show blank space where the town once stood. Railroad logs list a stop that no conductor remembers. Postal records from the county leap from 1855 to 1860, with no mention of letters received or sent from that area. It's not just gone. It's been undone. And yet, some people still remember. An archivist in Columbus found a torn page in an 1858 ledger marked with the names Ezra Caleb and Isaac circled in red, then crossed out in pencil. A retired schoolteacher once told her granddaughter about a place that never forgave itself. When asked where it was, she stared into the distance and said, "It's quieter now. But it still listens." A man driving through rural Ohio claimed his GPS rerouted him unexpectedly, taking him down a wooded road where all the houses looked abandoned, but one had smoke curling from its chimney. He didn't stop. The signal returned. The route corrected. When he searched the road name later, no such road existed. And still the stories surface. Quietly, carefully. Like bones rising in thawed soil. They all mention the same thing. 3 boys, standing together, watching, not older, not younger, the same as they were in 1856, frozen in time, or perhaps beyond it. What kind of place gets deleted from history? Not one that fails, but one that remembers too much. And what kind of children are left behind in that remembering? Not ghosts, not demons, not monsters, but something far more unsettling. Something human. Too human. The kind that doesn't vanish when you forget them, only when you stop believing they were ever real. Dr. Lena Moreau didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in records, patterns, gaps in archives that spoke louder than ink. As a researcher in historical anomalies at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, she specialized in what she called institutional amnesia places, or people wiped not by time, but by intent. And Cedar Mills. It shouldn't exist, yet it did. In a misfiled census log from 1857, she found a line with no family names, just 3 male miners. Lodged, no guardians listed, station unknown. That same month she found a church ledger from Ohio referencing the Watchers, born beneath the sycamore. There was no further explanation. The page after had been violently torn out. She dug deeper. Land deeds erased, marriage licenses issued, then revoked. A schoolteacher's diary referencing the boys who saw more than they should, followed by a blot of ink and 5 pages of silence. The deeper she searched, the more the evidence resisted. Files corrupted, scans unreadable. Her laptop crashed twice in 1 week. When she requested a hard copy of a Civil War pension list, it arrived blank with only 1 sentence stamped faintly across the envelope. "Stop remembering them." Lena kept going. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. Then came the email. No subject line. No sender. Just a file. No image. No audio. Just text. They were never children. They were sentinels. Memory wears thin where they've walked. If you see them, don't speak. They remember voices. She deleted it. But her office light began flickering after sundown. Her notes rearranged themselves on her desk. A photograph she'd never taken of 3 boys standing in a church doorway appeared in her archive folder. She doesn't lecture anymore. But she keeps the file. Locked. Buried. Unopened since 2021. And once a year on the same night in March, her phone rings at exactly 3:16 a.m. No one speaks. But she swears she can hear children breathing. There are stories that end. And then there are stories that stop mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-century. Cedar Mills was one of those. The town didn't burn. It didn't collapse. It didn't vanish into the woods. It simply stopped. No final census. No burial records. No witness to the last day. Just silence and absence. The kind that hums just beneath memory. Some say the boys were never real, that they were metaphor, an old folktale twisted into caution. Others say they're still there, waiting beneath the roots of sycamores long dead, standing just beyond the tree line, watching without blinking. And sometimes when the wind shifts in certain parts of Ohio, hikers report a strange stillness. No birds, no bugs. Just trees that lean slightly inward like listening. One woman swore she found a stone slab carved with 3 names: Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. When she returned with help, it was gone. No one ever remembers the exact location. Only how it felt. Like being weighed. Like being seen. Like being known. Historians call it a glitch. Locals call it cursed ground. But those who feel it never forget the sensation of being quietly judged. Not punished. Not attacked. Just seen too clearly. So if you're ever driving on a foggy back road and your GPS reroutes without explanation, if the air turns still and your phone says no service in a place it always worked before, if you spot 3 children standing perfectly still at the edge of a clearing, don't wave. Don't speak. Don't remember. Because if you do, they might remember you back.